History has repeated itself. The Taliban is back in power in Afghanistan, and the prospects for Afghanistan's women and girls are at a critical juncture. As the Pakistan-backed Taliban confirmed that it has entered Kabul, the editor of Tolo News in Afghanistan today shared pictures of how photos of women outside a shop in Kabul were being painted over. Is this an early sign that some of the rights won by Afghan women over the past 20 years since the hardline militant movement was toppled could be reversed? If so, what does the international community need to do to ensure that the women and girls of Afghanistan are not abandoned as a political settlement is worked out on the ground? Remember, when they last ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, women could not work, girls were not allowed to attend school, and women had to cover their faces and be accompanied by a male relative if they wanted to venture out of their homes. Women who broke the rules sometimes suffered humiliation and public beatings by the Taliban's religious police under the group's strict interpretation of Islamic law. So joining us on the show for tonight from Washington, D.C., Lisa Curtis, Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security; Heather Brar, Associate Director of the Women's Rights Division, a former Afghan researcher at Human Rights Watch. We have Mariam Vardak, founder of Her Afghanistan, and Nishta Satyam, Deputy Country Representative at UN Women India. I want to start though first with Aziza Sadat and Pashtana Zalmi. They are joining us from Afghanistan. I'm not going to say from where in Afghanistan for their own safety and security. Okay, Ms. Pashtani, you were saying that your work was already curtailed. Pashtani Durrani?
Yes, Pashtana Durrani. So our work is already challenged in South Asia and Central Asia. Work like this is already challenged. But the point here is that right now it's challenged in a sense where Taliban are claiming that they will let the girls study. But then I question them, what are you going to let them study, right? Because in the past they have claimed that they let the girls study, but then it's again Islamic studies, religious studies. That wouldn't make them what do we call it, professionals, right? Religious studies is part of our upbringing. Every Afghan has to go through that who's a Muslim, who is brought up in an Afghan household, right? So my question here is, what sort of studies, and also about women rights, what political rights do we have right now, what social rights do we have right now, what is the mobility that we can access, right? So all these questions, they make me want to ask them again and again. And the work that we have been doing, of course it's challenged, and it has been challenged in the past, but it's challenged right now in a sense where it can be stopped any minute.
And Ms. Durrani, what is the atmosphere, the mood right now on the ground for women like you who've been working? You've chosen to work in this field of ensuring education for Afghan girls in rural areas specifically. But the mood right now, from where you see around you, the mood in Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan?
People are scared. People are trying to flee. People are trying to stay at homes. They want to get all their belongings and leave the country as soon as possible. Nobody wants to live under an environment which is suffocating, right? People are saying, okay, it was a peaceful transition. I mean, like in 21st century, you shouldn't be expecting so much bloodshed, right? Not that it was right in the past, but right now we should be talking humanely. We should be talking more diplomatically. But the whole point here is, post this transition, what the future awaits us, that's more of an issue, and people are scared of it. People are scared to think of it. And I, being the one person who always plans, I don't want to think about it at all.
So a sense of fear and dread about what the future is going to bring. The Taliban has, as they have in talks with the US and the international community, their leadership has hinted at an openness to changing policies. They've claimed that women will be able to participate in public life if it comes to power. The Taliban spokesperson has dismissed as rubbish and baseless propaganda reports that women will be forced into marriages with, Taliban officers, etc., etc. But the question is, can the Taliban be trusted, especially since they clearly have an upper hand on the ground? Given their swift takeover, they have no need to accommodate anyone on the ground. So can the Taliban be trusted to those words?
We don't have any choice at this point but to do the best we can to try to hold them to the commitments that they've made, whether or not there's any basis to trust them. I think it's not a secret that, first of all, their actions on the ground have often not reflected some of these somewhat more open-minded statements they've made about women's rights. Second of all, even at their best, their statements do not reflect gender equality by any means or Afghanistan's obligations under international law. But right now, all we can do is try to mobilize the international community to insist that they respect women and girls.
So this is not the time to step back. This is actually the time to come forward and speak for women's rights in Afghanistan. But Heather, let me ask you, the achievements made by women in the past 20 years, right, since the Taliban's ouster, yes, they are incremental, but they're meaningful because it is still a deeply conservative, male-dominated society. We've seen images of girls in school, women in parliament, in government, and in business. So is the world overreacting in a sense? What I mean is, can these gains be so quickly nullified?
Yes, of course they can be nullified by an abusive dictatorship, which may well be what's being put in place in Afghanistan right now. Of course, women's rights can be rolled back. I mean, the achievements of Afghan women and girls over the last 20 years are extraordinary and have come through incredible hard work. The support of the international community was important, but it's mostly come from the work of women and girls. But if the Taliban is determined to put their foot on the neck of women, there's not a lot that can be done, especially if the international community is ready to look away, which they too often have done.
Lisa Curtis, will the international community look away? U.S. President Joe Biden has called the end of America's longest war an accomplishment. But as you can hear from Pashtani and Aziza, there's a sense of dread that's omnipresent, especially among women, as the Taliban forces have, routed, completely taken over the country. Can the U.S. absolve itself of this reality on the ground right now?
Absolutely not. It's not an accomplishment. It's a catastrophe. I think, as we just heard Prime Minister Modi say on this day of Indian independence, you have Afghanistan who's lost its independence, lost any hope for the future of democracy in its country. So this is a tragic, catastrophic day for Afghanistan. And it is the U.S. moral responsibility to continue to stand up for women's rights, women's participation in the life of the country, education, healthcare, all of those problems that we saw under the Taliban. We saw that women were not able to get the healthcare they needed. They didn't go to school. Mortality rates were higher. Really awful stories. So until the Taliban proves that they've changed, I don't think we should take them at face value. We should insist that that these things happen if there's any hope of the Taliban engaging with the international community. So the U.S. should lead an effort. We can work with the UN. The UN Security Council can certainly mobilize, speak out on this issue, condition any future assistance to Afghanistan on respecting the rights of women. So we don't know. I think we can definitely say that things will not be easy for women. We are going to see some backtracking. The question is how much. And I think the international community can play a huge role in what that looks like and in stemming the slide for women's rights in Afghanistan. But I also want to mention that there are women that have targets on their back that need to get out of the country. So there's a lot of efforts being put into getting those women who need to get out of the country out. So I just wanted to make the point that those efforts continue. Obviously, not all the women will be able to get out. They'll be living in Afghanistan and have to stand up for their rights. And they certainly deserve the strong support of the international community. And as I said, it's the moral responsibility of the United States.
Moral responsibility, the onus now on the international community. Nishta Satyam, the world should help us. That's what you're hearing from Afghani women on Twitter. The onus now on organizations like the UN to help out.
Absolutely, I think there's no denying that there's a complete moral responsibility that the UN undertakes. I think the Secretary General has issued a statement and his despair and dismay at the reversal of rights. Again, I think the UN's sustained effort is to include women's voices in peace negotiations. And ultimately, at this point in time, it is not just about ensuring that women's rights are upheld, but it's also about women's voices in that negotiation that's happening inside that country. And I think that's where the international community must keep its pressure, the donor community must keep its pressure, particularly neighbors, I think, have a profound responsibility at this point in time to reach out and to ensure safety and security, access to mobility, access to work, so many aspects that absolutely
you
must
said neighbors
negotiate.
have a responsibility. What is, do you know, can you share with us what India is doing in this regard?
I think it's too soon, and it's not my story to tell us at this point. But what I can definitely say is that the donor community, particularly countries that stand closest in terms of geographical location, proximity, have a greater responsibility at this point in time to help. If not just in negotiation, but in so many other ways to ensure that people are safe. India has, of course, had a very open policy to our brothers and sisters from Afghanistan, and hopefully we will see that continue and blossom in the future to come. But really, at this point in time, the one thing that we are reminded again is how quickly the rights of women and girls can be reversed absolutely in almost no time. And I agree with Lisa, it's not so much about whether it will reverse. I think we all have an educated and informed yes on that. But how much, how far are we going to go back in time? Where are we going to have to start with? What is that point for us? And I think that's where we must, you can only uphold a regime against something that they have committed to. So it is very important that at this point when negotiations are going on, that the rights of women and girls are penciled in and agreed with. And I think upholding is a process that will follow.
Ironically, as Amnesty, I think, has pointed out, there are no women representatives in these talks as they take place. So there's somebody else speaking for the rights of women. But you raised another issue about global donors. And let's bring in Mariam Vardak. She runs Her Afghanistan. That's an organization that works for the advancement of women's rights, women's empowerment. It's a global online platform for professionals around the world to support Afghan women in various fields. Mariam, a catch-22 or a double-edged sword right now. I think that's the correct word, because in the midst of all of this, there are reports that donor countries to Afghanistan are also cutting back on funding, and that will mean it will affect programs that are vital for women's rights on the ground.
I've mentioned this numerous times. As soon as the physical withdrawal of foreign troops, there is going to be a withdrawal of finance support and diplomatic presence. And we're seeing that right now. I think that the international community is not valuing how much the Afghan National Defense Security Forces have sacrificed for them, leaving in such a short, unannounced method and in such a chaotic way, causing more stress upon the Afghan people is just inhumane. Your speakers have mentioned the fact, and you've mentioned that there are no female presence. The blame does not only go on the international community, the blame also falls on the people of Afghanistan and the Afghan government. When the delegation was sent to Doha and the delegation was created, there was very little noise about how many women were there and the type of conversations that were taking place. Right now, what is taking over the media is what will happen to the women. So if that is so important, why did we not raise our concern back then? From day one, wherever I have spoken, I have mentioned that the delegation should have been all women, and they should have been religious Islamic scholars. Islamic scholars are the only ones who can hold theological arguments to uphold a woman's status in society.
Fascinating. Very interesting point. Heather Brar, we're getting reports on the ground already. I'm not sure if these can be confirmed, but I think Reuters was reporting that women employees working in banks in Afghanistan have been told in some banks to go home and that they can be replaced by male employees. Are these the reports that you're hearing too on the ground?
So I haven't seen that specific report, but over the last 2 months since the U.S. announced its withdrawal, we've heard a lot of reports from around the country about similar things happening, with women being told that they are no longer allowed to work, they're no longer allowed to leave the house without a mahram, a male family member. We've been hearing reports from even further back about NGO workers who have women employees, NGOs that have women employees being told that they need to replace those women with male employees. So I think this is a very clear example among several examples of a situation where the Taliban's rhetoric does not match their actions on the ground, and that indicates either that they can't control their local commanders or that their rhetoric is just that rhetoric and they don't actually intend to comply with what they're saying when it comes to day-to-day operations.
Pashtana Durrani, we've already been seeing some attacks over the past few weeks and months on female journalists and other high-profile women. There was, this back and forth between the government and the Taliban, this whodunit, both pointing fingers at each other. But is there an increased fear of working women, especially women journalists? Because right now it's a question of narrative. Whose narrative can be spread the world over?
See, if you have to listen to the narrative, maybe listen to the narrative of the Afghan women rather than the government or the Taliban, right? Because it's their narrative that matters, right? And the second thing is, the women, I come from Kandahar, and the women were from Kandahar, they were from Azizi Bank, and they were asked to go home and send in someone from their families to fill in for them. So that's the second thing. When it comes to journalists and women NGO workers or in any field other than the healthcare workers, they have been asked to stop and they have been asked to go back home and it's not allowed or whatever. But then again, it's not just right now the government's narrative that we have to see that in the past 2 months, if the women were dying, what was the reason behind it? And if the Taliban were saying if we are not targeting them, who was then targeting them? See, one thing we for sure have to understand that women of Afghanistan, their futures have been traded in a war between two men, right? The government, it was all led by men, and the Taliban, it is led by men. There were no women in this both groups, right? Right now you see Ghani meeting Ghani. Mullah brother is a Ghani and President Ghani was Ghani. President Ghani had corrupt technocrats in his group. He enabled them, his ministers were corrupt, and he didn't stop them, right? We could have built a very good army, we could have built a very good political institution, but they didn't do it in the past 2 decades. So they are there to be blamed for 50%. And then at the same time, Taliban should realize one thing: a country cannot progress without its women. If you are asking 50% of women who are engineers, doctors, journalists, teachers to sit at home just because you feel like it's not going to help with your ideology, it's not going to help you build your country. It's not going to help you financially stabilize your country. You have to look at country economically, right? So if you're going to ask the girls to educate themselves in Islamic or religious studies, then what about their professions? What are they going to become? What about the representation of Afghan women? If they are not going to be in the parliament, if they cannot vote, then what about their voices? What about the specific needs that they have right now, right? So these are all sort of different things that you have to think about the narrative right now that Afghan women have. The rural women lost all their men. They are not skilled. They are not educated. They have to abandon their house in the past 3 weeks because of the Taliban offensive or the government offensive, and now the Taliban are asking them to go back, but they cannot do anything. Like, for example, I met a girl. She was selling potatoes post 3 days of her husband dying, right? Can she do that right now? She was feeding her husband, her children, right? She cannot do that right now. So we have to understand that narratives and on the ground differ from that of the people in the ruling class. And I don't care if it's President Ghani leading the country or Mullah Bilal leading the country, as long as the essential, vital, the women rights and political rights are ensured. And I know there are few things that you can give up on. For example, the blue burqa, it's not a big deal. Every woman can wear it. It's not a big deal, right? But you asking a girl that she should stop learning from general curriculum or stop going to a school, that's not right. That's not acceptable. If you're asking women not to vote, that's not right. So you have to understand what are our priorities and what are not. And this I can say for myself and the family that I have grown up in and the district that I come from. Women are willing to give up on some things that are like, that we think are too out of our culture context, but not everything that we have gained, not all the educational rights that we have right now, not the mobility rights. I don't want to be around a man who's literally like my dead limb so that he can mobilize me. I don't want that. For once, the people have to understand that Afghan women, their voices matter, and we have to understand the ground realities, that a country cannot be stable without its 50% if they are not working. We are not Saudi, we are not other Gulf countries, we don't have oil. We need financial stability, we need people in offices, we need people working, we need women working. So that's all.
That's not all, that's actually everything, because you clearly made it clear that the gains that have been made when it comes to women's rights, women are empowered. There are women like you, I mean, in urban areas, and that's one of the biggest accomplishments of the 20 years of the US-led forces being deployed in Afghanistan. I'm going to try Aziza once again. Aziza Sadat, if I can, if we can hear you, I'd just like to give you the last word. You're a woman journalist. Women journalists have been targeted. Have you received any kind of such messaging from the Taliban? What would you like to say on the show tonight to anyone listening?
Hi, ma'am. Sorry for bad receptions. According to Christian, my answer is we are very scared. People are very scared of what's going to happen to them. On about Taliban agenda. If Taliban will torture and kill women who were active and supportive of women's rights or work for government of Afghanistan, and women who work for the foreign NGOs. Afghan women worked very hard for over 20 years and achieved a lot. We had women work in parliament, governmental office, journalists, and many other capacities. It is disheartening to see these women stay at home doing nothing.
Well, our thoughts are with the women and the girls of Afghanistan tonight. 2 decades of hard-won progress by Afghanistan's women and girls at serious risk of being unraveled, says Amnesty International. It is important, it is essential to keep supporting women's rights in Afghanistan right now. This is not the time to walk away. Thank you all for joining us tonight on We the People. Bye-bye.